Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. We're on the Compliance Podcast Network, where you can find many other compliance podcasts. I'm Mary Shirley, and today I'm pleased to welcome Samantha Kelen to the show. Samantha, please tell us about yourself and welcome.
Hi, Mary. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm super excited to be here. I'm really thrilled to be able to share some information with you guys, but considering what your podcast is about and like great women in compliance, I've been kind of watching from the sidelines for a long time. And so I'm so excited to have been invited to actually be here today. A little bit of a fangirl moment, but anyway, happy to share some background. I describe myself as a bit of a compliance and ethics nerd. And I'm really fortunate to have been kind of dumped here. Like I got here not intentionally, but by chance. I was not one of those folks who are either a lawyer and end up here or who were in the business and ended up here. My entire corporate career has been in compliance and ethics. And for that, I'm really, really grateful because I didn't know it existed at all. I wasn't like a kid in elementary school. And when they were like, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a compliance officer. Like, I didn't even know that was a thing. And so I got here actually through a temp agency. I started out in college and I took a little bit of a detour and I went to go horseback ride for a living. That didn't work out. And so I decided to go back and finish my college degree, and I got a job temping and was assigned basically as the administrative assistant to a compliance officer. And that was my first introduction. And I realized that it was actually a really cool place to be. And it really spoke to sort of my own personal values, right? Like doing the right thing. I've always been one of those people who cared about justice and like the sense of fairness and equality and right and wrong. And even before I really knew what that meant, I knew it spoke to me. And so learning about compliance and learning about some of the elements of the programs and sort of that first introduction made me realize it was something that I wanted to keep doing. And so from that organization, I got a job at a managed care organization that did dental benefits. And got my first like sort of compliance specialist job, right? I wasn't an administrative assistant anymore for the compliance department. I was a compliance specialist. And that's where I learned how to write policies and how to do audits and regulations and all that kind of stuff. And I then transitioned over to the energy and utilities industry, and I stayed there for a while. And have now cycled back over to the healthcare side. And, you know, being able to be back on the healthcare side in the middle of a global pandemic has been super frustrating and challenging, but also really rewarding, right? And I love that I'm able to be of service here. I think that's part of our jobs in general, right? We're not a revenue generating organization. We're really a service organization. And this is super cliche, and I'm going to share it anyway. I don't like to take credit for it because it's so cheesy. But I actually said this in my interview for the last job when they said, you know, why you, or why do you want this job? Why compliance? My response was that, you know, when I get up in the morning and I wake up, I'm not going to work for the man. I'm going to work for mankind. And I really believe that, right? Like I almost get choked up when I say it, because, you know, we're really making sure that our organizations are doing the right thing, that our employees are acting ethically, and I can feel good about that. And that just makes it easier to go to work every day. And then lastly, you know, part of my personal ethos around compliance work is to be human and to be authentic, because I think, you know, there's so much of a challenge around being the police, right? And being the Department of No and all of that stuff. And I feel like if you can be approachable, it just makes things that much easier on you and your teams. And you're much more likely to hear about things before they get really bad if somebody feels like they can pick up the phone and call you. So I try to remember that and try to remind folks that like, we're people, we're just normal people, right? Come talk to us and hope that plays out for the best. So that's a little bit about me.
Love it. And I'm pretty sure everyone who was listening in felt the term compliance nerd really resonate, because you probably wouldn't be listening to the show unless you were one. And all of the fluffy people out there like me love the quote, and I will be stealing that one. I like a bit of cheese, and no one does cheesiness better than Team America. So not surprised and loving it.
Very, very true.
While we were preparing for our conversation today, you brought up the idea of getting real, which ties back into the theme of being human and authenticity that you just mentioned. And I'm very much a follower of this as well. Why do you see this as being an important tool for your compliance program?
Yeah, so to like pull on that thread a little bit more about being approachable, right? I'm actually one of those folks who finds small talk challenging. And at one point, I think there's even a bio out there that says I'm like a true extrovert. And maybe it's just because I'm jaded as I get older. Maybe the pandemic has changed us all. But I actually find myself getting more and more introverted. And I tend to be one of those people who likes to leave my home life at home and work at work, right? So I try to keep them separate. But I have to remember that there's this whole group of people out there who find fulfillment and connection and relationships and all of that stuff through their work. And so I have to remind myself to take the time to get to know people, right? And it actually works out for your benefit if you know, I have a coworker who says, I'll be like, hey, can you help me out with this? And she'll be like, do you have chocolate? And I'll be like, yes, I do have chocolate. I'll get that right to you, right? And so like being able to form those relationships and connections with people and actually taking the time to say, hey, how are your kids, right? Hey, oh, look, your dog's in the background right now that we're all on Zoom. I think your dog needs your attention, right? Like being able to make those connections and be human builds social capital, right? So that you can either ask for more intimate details or ask for help, right? It's always better to ask for help with someone that you have a pre-established relationship with. But I also just love being real and being authentic and human with other parts of the business, because then I feel like you're more approachable, right? And, if you're like super stiff and uptight and you never make a mistake and you never tell a joke, like laughter is the biggest icebreaker I find. You're super rigid, or you only ever say no, or you never ask about somebody's dog, then they're less likely to pick up the phone and call you when they need help. And in every presentation I give about the compliance team, I say, hey, it's always easier to call us and ask a question than it is to respond to our investigation when it goes sideways, right? Like, I
love that.
From like a time perspective, even, right? Like you don't want to deal with us investigating either, right? Like we don't want to investigate. You don't want us investigating. So like, hey, just pick up the phone and ask us front end rather than dealing with us when things go sideways. And so that works only to an extent. Sometimes I feel like being real and being human is actually an even better method than fear, because that's just another version of fear. Like,
yeah,
when it's investigating, like that's another threat, right? And that's not helpful either.
I feel like that one is humor as well, right? So yeah, I think the fear thing, and that was something, I think a trap I fell into very early on was, touting the prison sentences and the cost of investigation, front loading that rather than letting it whisper quietly was a learning point. And you're absolutely right. The human side is critical. One of the things that I've incorporated of late is when I meet a new sort of team in the business that I haven't dealt with before, I'll introduce myself, but instead of talking about, my years in compliance or what I do at the company in great detail, I just say, hi, my name is Mary, and I really like Hello Kitty, and hold up my phone case, which has got Hello Kitty on it. And Lisa Fine knows that I use that very often, even in compliance conferences as well, because it is a way to let someone know about something that you're interested in outside of work. And unfortunately, I feel like we're on the back foot in compliance because I think we're viewed as holier than thou, right? Like the person who's very preachy about doing the right thing. So in order to combat that, I like to be vulnerable and honest if there is something that I think is confusing initially about a policy, and then say, yeah, this is something that it took me a bit of time to grapple with, and here's how I learned to deal with it. Because when we come across as being Ms. or Mr. Perfect, that's incredibly unattractive, and it's not very relatable. And because we are in the job function that we are, I think we need to do extra work to peel back the layers on that and show that we make mistakes too, hopefully mistakes that, don't cause massive compliance issues. But, I will be the first to say, oopsie, I forgot to file that, and I should have put that in the right folder for good documentation purposes. I make mistakes too.
Yeah, being real, it's really easy to say. It's one of those things that like you can pay lip service to it, but actually doing it really requires you to be vulnerable, which is like a whole nother part of the conversation, right? But I really do believe that the pandemic and remote work, if you're fortunate, has actually created more opportunities for that, right? For example, like the example I gave about the dog in the background. So I have a very small, very chatty cat who always, I'm surprised she's not here. I actually forgot to make sure she wouldn't appear. So please forgive me. But I have a very chatty cat who likes to make her opinions known on most of my Zoom calls. And I now introduce her, like in the middle of the call, if she's here and we're doing introductions, they'll be like, oh, also this is Shima. Please say hi to Shima, right? She'll probably be here. So now we all get a good laugh about my very chatty cat, right? And it's just an icebreaker. But you've also heard a lot in the compliance circles around training and communications. Some folks are very into humor, right? Some people feel like some topics are so serious that humor is inappropriate. And I think you can find a balance. And I wanted to give an example. I haven't done this, but it's something I've been thinking about, where I wanted to have a pretend conversation with my cat about, say, for example, a hotline, where I could be like, hey, Shima, how are you doing today? And she would meow at me. And I'd be like, oh, really? That sounds like a serious concern. You should talk to someone about that. And then she'd be like, meow, meow. And I'd be like, no, really, the folks in the compliance team are and we would have this pretend conversation where I'd be translating for her or whatever. A conversation with Compliance Kitty. And again, we're just humans. We're not so serious. We can have a humorous conversation with our cats to get a compliance message across, right? Think about how many more people you would get talking about your silly video with your cat than just through an all company email or something like that, right? I think there's a time and place for it, but I think the human and humorous approach can definitely go a long way if you do it well.
I totally agree. It reminds me a little bit, I don't know if you saw this, several years back, there was a compliance babies discussion, and it was subtitled. So the babies were making baby sounds, and it was just this really hilarious and something that just resonated completely with your day-to-day life. I can't remember what the issue was.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen that, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. We're really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that sounds awful.
I'm going to find that for you and send it to you afterwards.
That would be awesome.
So you've told us a little bit about why this is important, and let's take a deeper dive into how it plays out in reality. So how does this show up in your role as a leader?
Yeah, great question. I think there's sort of two components, right? How does authenticity and reality and being human show up for your compliance program? And then how does it show up as a leader, right? And I try to really incorporate this into my style, I guess, if you would call it that, in two ways. The first is for my employees, and the second is for the business. So if my team, if I'm a real human, then so are the members of my team. And I always try to create safety for my teammates to be real people. And sometimes it's actually not that easy to do, especially for high performers when we're used to working beyond the 9-to-5 schedule, or we're used to, checking emails at all hours and responding to emails at all hours. I got to remind myself that as a leader, people look to you for the example. And so if I'm emailing at 10 o'clock at night, they're going to feel there's an obligation to respond.
Mm-hmm.
Or like, if I'm working all weekend, they might feel like they have to work all weekend. And so I try to remember that my team is watching me. Right? And so I'll give an example of this came up a couple of weeks ago where I actually, hopefully this is okay to get into, but I actually got my second dose of my vaccine. And I didn't have horrible side effects, but the next day I had like a low-grade fever and I felt kind of crappy and I had the muscle aches. And I had a whole retreat planned, like a half-day retreat planned with my team. And it was the second day of the retreat. It was like the last half. And I actually thought that if I had side effects from the vaccine, it was going to be the day after. And so it sort of caught me by surprise. And I knew that I could probably muscle through the retreat and we could get it done. But I didn't want my team to feel like they would have to muscle through if they had a fever. And so we got on at the start and I said, hey, everyone, I'm really sorry. I feel like garbage. And I know the right thing as humans to do is to cancel this retreat. And we'll schedule some other time in the future. But I don't feel great. And I don't want you guys to feel like you would have to muscle through this if you didn't feel great. Because I wouldn't. Right. And it's so funny how like I could absolutely give my team the grace not to have to do that retreat. But then I would somehow convince myself that I had to, right? And so like thinking about how people are looking at you for your role model, like as a remote modeling, what behavior is appropriate and what is not. And if I want them to take care of themselves and their families, I have to take care of myself and my family, right? And so I always try to create safety for them to be real people with real families, with real lives outside of work, and sometimes, quite frankly, real struggles, right? Like we are all facing some kind of struggle, particularly through this pandemic. And so, have a family emergency, go. No questions, go, right? Work can wait. What can I do to help? How can we cover it for you, right? Like just really create safety for them to take care of the other things that they need to do, because work is not the most important thing on the planet, right? Like, yes, we all absolutely have goals, but like that phrase that you hear, or the story where, nobody on their deathbed ever said, I wish I had spent more time at work. Right. And so, keeping an eye on the things that are important. And so the second piece of that is related to the business. And so when we have a project that we've got to plan with the business, I make sure to talk to them about what's going on for them right now. Like, what does their reality look like? Are they happy and engaged? Are they meeting targets and succeeding and everything is like in a good place? Or are there like really big projects and deadlines looming? Everybody heads down on something super important. Or are they overwhelmed and drowning? Because then that's going to help you know how to frame your messaging, right? There have been times working on projects in the past where I've been like, I am so sorry that I have to ask you to do this right now, but I have to ask you to do this right now, right? Like, where at least if you can take time to acknowledge what's going on for them, then they might not feel like so attacked, or they not feel like I'm talking at them, that I'm actually there to partner with them. And understanding how they see the world at that moment will go a long way in building the partnership to get what you need. Because that's the part I find always so difficult about our job is, as compliance officers, really, we have no authority over anyone or anything, right? And we've literally just got to convince people to do what we need them to do. And short of begging, building relationships is the easiest way to accomplish that. And if you are at least acknowledging and creating space for teammates everywhere, right? Either folks that you work with directly or folks that work out in the business, to acknowledge the reality of their situation and create space for it, and then find plans and strategies to approach and deal with the reality, not what you think it could be, but with the reality, then you'll get a lot more traction in whatever you need to accomplish. So those are the ways I try to think about it.
So I think a really great revelation there that I enjoyed from your story was that when you sought to acknowledge and respect and be considerate of others, you ended up engaging in self-care for yourself.
I have to, because otherwise you're just a hypocrite, right? Like, I actually had a moment where I was like, if you wouldn't want them to work with a fever, then you shouldn't work with a fever either. And it sounds so basic, right? Like, you laugh, but it's like, no, I really had to take a step back and be like, no, I wouldn't want them to. So why should I, right? And I had to be really intentional about modeling that and practicing self-care, to your point.
The other thing is that I think that the type of leadership that you are deploying and bringing into your world is essentially servant leadership. And you and I are of the same generation, which is going to be the next big generation of leaders and executives that we see in the workplace. So what I think we're going to see more broadly is a wider uptick in that. We see the Gentlemen at Compliance line have a very similar philosophy in terms of really caring for your staff and understanding that is, one, an ethical way to live life, but also it helps the bottom line. So I'm hopeful that you're paving the way forward for a very thoughtful form of leadership moving forward, one that embraces compassion and true care for others. So that brings me to the next question of people often talking about bringing their whole self to work. And I heard something recently about how someone was saying that they don't want to have a team member in the workplace who's only turning up as a part of themselves. They want to have that person feel like everything that they bring is right there in front of them and present. And I note that this does sound like a wonderful idea in theory and is meant to support ideas of diversity and inclusion. Do you think you have to bring your whole self to work in order to be authentic?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so my short answer is not necessarily. I loved the concept of bringing your whole self to work, right? When I was earlier in my career, I was like, yes, I want to work somewhere where I can bring my whole self to work. And I've actually sort of challenged the status quo with sort of like microaggressions. For example, like I have tattoos on my fingers, right? I have little dots.
Oh, you do too.
On my fingers, right? And I think anyone would be like, an executive can't have tattoos that are visible, right? But this is part of me and who I am, right? And so I'm like, well, why not, right? Like if you don't want to hire me over some dots, then I think we have bigger problems, right? And so, that's part of my way of being authentic and being who I am and trying not to let maybe some of the traditional expectations of an executive box me into something that I'm not. But over time, I've found out that as beautiful a concept and theory, it's actually kind of terrifying in practice. Right. So like, I can sit here and be like, yeah, if you don't want to hire me over my dots, like, I don't want to work for you anyway. But it's also terrifying to bring your whole self to work every day because not everybody's going to embrace you the way you want to be embraced. Right. So like, you actually have to be incredibly vulnerable with folks in order to bring your whole self to work. Right. Like that's why we don't share all of our secrets, or we don't share everything about us with everyone we encounter, right? We have like close friends that we share things with and other people and family members that we're more comfortable being our full selves because we know that they'll accept us and love us and embrace us and validate us and all that stuff. And when you do that in the work environment, it's kind of unrealistic to expect that everybody will do that for you. Now, obviously, most work environments talk about respect, right? Like as a minimum, you should be treated with respect. But there's also times where, depending on your interest and viewpoints, it's just not appropriate to do those things or discuss those things at work, right? And so there's actually another strategy that I try to employ about, being authentic at work that allows me to still have safe boundaries with folks, right? And that's really about acknowledging again that I'm human, and therefore that means I make mistakes. So I try to practice accountability as much as I can, and then acknowledge again, like what that means to me is if I've made a mistake, own up to it. Like you said earlier, right? You gave an example about like, oh, I forgot to file that. Let me fix it, right? So owning up to your mistakes, taking accountability, and then trying to make this right. And so this also gives me the opportunity to give the disclaimer about like my leadership style and all the stuff that I'm sharing today. Like, let me be the first to say, I don't get it right every day. And in a conversation I was recently having with one of my teammates, I said something about another teammate that may have been appropriate to share out of frustration with a friend, but was not appropriate to share with another teammate. And I immediately corrected, and I was like, that wasn't nice to say, and the teammate was creating safety for me, and they were like, no, it's okay. Like, I totally get it. No problem. And like continued the conversation. But the longer I sat with it overnight, I was like, God, that wasn't right. And again, I can acknowledge that it came from a place of frustration, but I didn't want to sweep it under the rug. Even though the teammate said it wasn't a big deal, I wanted to be accountable for it. So the next day I called them back up and I said, look, I know you said this was okay, but I just want to be really clear that it wasn't, right? Like that it was not okay. And it was not an appropriate thing for me to say, no matter how frustrated I was with the situation. And I just felt like I needed to do that, right? Because it can be a really dangerous trap to think that you're the leader and you should have it right all the time and have all the answers, and that you're never going to make mistakes, because you absolutely are, even if it is just calling someone or, talking about somebody in a way that you shouldn't have. And so I find that the accountability part and owning up to your mistakes makes you human enough that you don't also have to tell them about all of your personal life at home. Like that's just not always appropriate, right? And to a certain extent. And so that's the approach that I try to take, which I find is in many ways more safer and appropriate for the work environment.
I totally agree. I think, there is this concept of some thoughts are really meant only for you. And no matter how close a friend someone is, that's still, something that you should keep to yourself. And at work, there are certain boundaries that we do need to respect. And there are several facets to every single person. You can show many of those facets and maintain authenticity without everyone knowing every single detail. I mean, you'd be a total narcissist if you took up everyone's time by letting them know everything that you were thinking and contemplating.
Yeah, and not everybody's going to share the same viewpoints, right? Like we all lived that in the U.S. last year during the election cycle, and right. Sometimes it's just a little bit easier to keep some of the stuff for yourself and your friends and your family.
It's a double-edged sword in that the more you give people, the more that they have to like about you, but also the more they have to dislike about you if you don't happen to be on the same page.
Or quite frankly, use against you, which sounds, which is like the pessimistic piece of me, right? But yeah, the more you give up, the more you reveal, the more risk you're taking, right? And you just got to acknowledge that is literally what being vulnerable is about. And the work environment is not always the right place to do that.
Yeah. So we're agreeing that there is a certain level of vulnerability that's going to be helpful to you. But once you hit a certain threshold, there's a law of diminishing returns.
Exactly. And again, I feel like being accountable for your mistakes is probably a safer way to do that, right? now, obviously, they can always use those against you too, but that's probably for a whole nother conversation.
I think about that a lot in terms of, do I look stupid if I just admit to something? And I think there is a risk of that. If you're making mistakes all the time and you're drawing attention to them, you might want to reconsider whether you're in the right role. If, however, you've got a really strong, not even really strong, if you have an adequate track record and you make the odd fluff up, no big deal. That's normal. So we've talked a lot about vulnerability and how it can be both a blessing and a curse, depending on how you choose to deploy it. Is there a component of this that you wish you could be better at, Samantha?
Oh my God. So many, but we're all a work in progress, right? If I had to pick one, I think the balance and sort of the right timing and right tone related to speaking your mind. So
yes.
I had a boss in the past, I think, who said some version of this, but basically, like, I've never been accused of not having an opinion. Like, I pretty much have an opinion about everything, and I will usually tell you what it is. And in some ways, that has served me well. But there's certainly a time and a place where your opinion, either they don't need it or it's not the right time. And certainly there's always a right way and a right tone to give your opinion. But one of the things I learned recently related to this was that the farther up the food chain you go, the more weight your opinion carries, whether you think it should or not, right? Like, I love to think of myself as like the average Joe who's totally approachable, right? Like, let's talk about my cat. But I forget that other people in the organization see my title and think that I should be treated differently, or that they need to respond right away, or that because of my title, my weight carries more opinion than theirs does, or than anybody else's does. And someone reminded me of that recently, where I made some sort of comment about something that rubbed me the wrong way. And I wasn't at all looking for anyone to solve it for me. It was really just like an kind of comical joke about something. And they were like, yeah, but you're a leader, like, you're a well-respected leader. And so people are going to try to fix it. Kind of like, people value what you say. And I was like, oh, they do? Right? Like that whole like imposter syndrome thing where you're like, really? Like, I'm just the average Joe with my cat. Like, what are you talking about? And so there's sort of a two-sided coin, right? Like, you have to be mindful of when you speak up, but then you also have to think about the consequences of your words. And then you throw in the added complication of being a woman. It's even harder when to figure out how to figure out when to share and when not to share, because we're often labeled as being bossy or aggressive, right? We just consider assertive and opinionated. Others consider or label as aggressive or bossy. You've seen all the memes online and LinkedIn about the little girl, bossy versus aggressive and all of that stuff. But I've learned that, we really need to take a second to pause before speaking in a lot of situations. And I've actually had colleagues, ping me after the fact and be like, I could literally hear you thinking before you spoke. Like, I could pregnant pause, right? Like, I could hear you being really, really intentional about what you're saying. That's a skill I think I still have to continue to work on, right? And I don't always get right. And hopefully we'll have lots of time to continue to practice, because I believe speaking up and being heard is part of the value that I add, right? I believe I add value. But when to do it and how to do it, and like taking the time to think it all the way through and consider how it will be received is something that I'm still working on. So if you've got any tips, or any of the listeners, certainly welcome them. I think it's something I'll be working on for a long time.
Well, I think part of that is the unfairness that we need to rail against as women, which is a man can say a statement and it's seen as an objective statement. We can make a response to that statement as a woman, and it's supposed to be an objective response, but proposing an alternative point of view is suddenly perceived as a challenge to what was just said. It's so bizarre and it's ridiculous. And so I put the question to you, Samantha, do you think that we ought to be extra flowery and polite when we put forward another suggestion so that people don't say, oh, you just challenged that man, when it's simply supposed to be another perspective?
Oh, gosh. If we need to be flowery and polite with every suggestion, I'm never going to make it. Like that. I mean, and part of that is like my upbringing. So for example, like I grew up north in the US. I grew up in New York. I've often heard, now that I live sort of in the South, I've had many people say to me, you're not from around here, are you? Right? Because I think my communication style is just faster. I move faster, I think faster. And as I mentioned before, right, the pleasantries and the sort of small is unnatural for me, right? So I actually think that a lot of my style is actually, or some of the conflicts is that I run into is that I'm not meek and I'm not sort of the traditional like Southern belle, right? And so I definitely think you have to be intentional about how you phrase things and what you say. But gosh, I fundamentally disagree with the fact that we need to try times harder or 10 times harder than our male counterparts. Because I do think some of this is just unfair, but I think if we want to continue to succeed, we have to be mindful of it, right?
That's right.
And that's what I've been trying to work on is it's less about how I intended it to sound and more about how it was received, right? This is, we talk about in compliance a lot of the time that perception matters, right? Even if there's no conflict of interest, right? The perception that there could be matters. And this is one of the times where what they think matters more than what I intended. And so I try to take those instances where I put my foot in my mouth or I say something the wrong way as an opportunity to go back and learn from it. It's not always pleasant. It's not always fun. But unfortunately, it's a little bit of just the way things are right now, at least in the world that we live in. And if we want to continue to succeed and we want to be thoughtful, kind, strategic, effective leaders, then that's just something you're going to have to do. And that, I will say, is part of the thing that frustrates me the most is being direct and getting things accomplished is what gets us here, right? It's what makes us good at what we do. But sometimes it can ruffle people's feathers. So you've got to find the right balance of continuing to be direct and get things done, but doing it in a way that doesn't ruin your career in the process, because that is never the goal, right?
Right.
So yeah, for sure.
I call those the career limiting moves, CLMs. We try to avoid those.
Yeah, I mean, I've made my fair share of them, right? For sure, we all have. But if we want to continue to grow and expand and progress, we've all got to learn how to navigate those situations.
So I think for me, the unfair and frustrating aspect is not the times when we have genuinely put a foot in our mouths, but when we get penalized for saying something as a woman. We know that the opposite gender would not have the same perception if they said it. What can we do as women leaders to make it better for those who come after us?
I'll take a second to pretend I'm like on stage accepting some award to thank all of those who came before me, because there absolutely have been some really solid men and women who have taught me countless lessons along the way, right? Like I exist today only as a product of those who have helped me. And I think the best example of how to continue helping others is your book. Right? Like the book is literally sending the elevator back down, right? And so what I love about the concept is it's one person offering assistance based on the lessons that they've learned, right? And like to carry through the theme of accountability and being human and making mistakes, we all just get to learn from each other, right? And trying to make the process easier for those who come after us. And so the other way that you and I have both been doing that is through our compliance career connections group, where I've had so many conversations with folks through that group where I've been like, okay, so there was this one time in an interview where they asked me what my biggest weakness was, and I had no idea. Like, I didn't have an answer. And I share with them how I made a mistake or how something didn't go according to plan. And I've been able to say, so after that, I went and researched how I should have answered that question. Here's what I'm going to share with you, right? And the other part is sharing your own experiences about what your career path has looked like, and reminding people that it's never perfect. Right? Like in the day, like it's funny, even on LinkedIn, you see everybody sharing their successes. It literally is the business version of Instagram, right? Where everybody looks perfect on the surface, right? But like my path to get to where I am today was not at all straight up and down. I didn't graduate from college in 4 years. Right. I took time in between both of my degrees. I took time off to go do other things. I learned a lot of lessons the hard way. And thankfully, I had enough people around me to keep me grounded and say like, no, keep going. Right. Or like, no, try it this way. Or, hey, I did that before. It didn't work. Try this. And so just sharing your experience about how things don't always go the way they're supposed to, but it's all going to be okay in the end, regardless. I think is so relatable. And again, I'm human and you're human. We're all just humans doing the best we can every single day. And if we can remind each other of that and take some of that pressure off, right? Like pressure to be perfect and get it right the first time and know exactly what you're supposed to do all the time. None of that's real. And if we can remind each other about what is real, like who we are as people and why we're here and what our priorities are and families matter. And, all of those things, I think that just creates more space for us to be who we are and move forward in the journey that is set for us, right? Everybody has a different journey. It's not going to be the same for everyone. And what you think might be the right thing to do may not work for everyone. So give people some space to find their way. So I don't know. I think that's what I've got.
I think that's a wonderful note to end the episode on. And you mentioned CCC, and I think this is a great opportunity to share one of the great pieces of feedback that you and I got recently was from one of our attendees who said that she had been attending a lot of networking events recently. And this was by far and away the best one because it was real people sharing real stories. And I think that sums up our entire episode today, that being authentic and being real isn't necessarily the easiest thing in the world, especially in the office. You can be scared of the effects that it can have. But being bold, taking a chance, taking calculated risks, being intentional about it, as Samantha was saying, can have a huge payoff for you, both personally and professionally. So we hope that this inspires you to show a little bit more of your true self in the office, and that you continue to build those relationships that will make you the most successful compliance officer. Thank you so much, Samantha, for your time today. It's been a real treat chatting with you, and I know that our listeners will relate to many of the things that we discussed today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.